Miss Marple and the Clock That Lost Its Time, a Miss Marple Story Section 1. The tick that faltered at 5 in the quaint village of Fern Hollow. Time had always moved at its own unhurried pace. Morning bells from St. Mildred's chimed softly. Across the hedgerows, tea was served precisely at 4, and the postman's bicycle creaked predictably along Church Lane. The rhythms of life, once set in place by generations, were rarely disturbed. That is, until the Pendlebury clock stopped. It was not, strictly speaking, unusual for a clock to lose time, particularly one as old as the brass-cased regulator that hung in the parlor of the Pendlebury tea-room, a beloved fixture in Fern Hollow. But on the morning of the village's annual spring fete, the venerable clock faltered in a most particular fashion. It stopped exactly at 5:17 p.m. and refused to move forward again. What made the event more curious was not merely the hour. It was what happened just minutes after the silence of the pendulum began at precisely 5:25 p.m. Miss Fiona Braithwaite was found dead. The fete, by then, was winding down. The bunting still fluttered above the green. Lemonade glasses clinked under parasols, and the vicar's wife was handing out the last slices of walnut sponge. In the tea-room garden, tucked between the clipped yew hedges and a riot of pink peonies, Fiona lay sprawled across the rattan settee, a teacup tilted from her hand, its contents trickling through the canework to the grass below. "I think she's fainted," someone had said at first. But then came the hush, the kind that settles over a crowd like falling ash. Miss Marple, seated at her usual table with a scone and her knitting, was among the first to stand. The doctor was summoned, but it was no use. Fiona Braithwaite, retired, schoolmistress, inveterate gossip, and part-time treasurer of the Women's Social Guild, was dead. The cause, Dr. Swithin muttered, was likely heart failure. Very sudden. "These things often are," he said, while dabbing sweat from his brow with a handkerchief. She was in reasonable health, but one can't always tell with these matters of the heart. Yet there was something in the way the teacup had broken, in the strange, still position of her arms, and in the oddly serene expression on Fiona's face that gave Miss Marple pause. She had just taken her second biscuit, observed Miss Marple to no one in particular. She never took a second unless she intended to linger. Sergeant Rayburn, who had arrived to manage the growing crowd, tried to usher people away with the usual blend of gentle admonition and rural tact. "Now then, if we could all let the doctor work, this isn't a performance, you know." Miss Marple stayed only until Fiona's body had been respectfully removed and the garden cordoned off. She excused herself quietly and walked home along the pebbled path toward her cottage on Old Bee Lane. Her expression was calm, but her eyes had narrowed behind her soft blue spectacles. Inside her parlor, she placed her knitting carefully on the side table and sat in the window nook. Her mind, so used to patterns in lacework and human behavior, began to stir with unease. Fiona Braithwaite had been many things: sharp-tongued, yes, but methodical, precise, the kind of woman who folded her gloves into one another and refused a second slice of anything unless it was sponge cake on Tuesday's dot. Why then had she lingered on fete days, something she abhorred? And why had the clock in the tea-room stopped at exactly the time the village would later learn of Fiona's death? "Things don't just stop," murmured Miss Marple, not without reason. Earlier that afternoon, Fiona Braithwaite had arrived, late to the fete. dressed in a pale lavender blouse and a surprisingly cheery hat adorned with artificial pansies. She had made her rounds slowly, greeting the vicar's wife with clipped politeness and offering pointed observations about the jam competition to whoever would listen. She had only seemed genuinely animated when she passed by a young woman with a fair complexion and anxious eyes, Sylvia Cartwright, daughter of the late magistrate and a recent returnee to the village after a family matter abroad. The exchange between them had been brief but cool. "Back for good, are you?" Fiona had asked in a tone like sugared arsenic. Sylvia had nodded, not quite meeting her eye. "Yes, I'm helping my aunt with the estate." That must be so comforting for her. It was then that Miss Marple, seated with her tea and a plum jam scone, had noticed Fiona slip a folded piece of paper from her handbag and tuck it beneath a napkin at an empty table. Moments later, when Sylvia sat down, her aunt having been called away to help slice cake, she found the paper. Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-row as she saw Sylvia glance at the paper, pale further, and tuck it quickly into her coat pocket. Fiona, meanwhile, had taken her tea and seated herself near the yew hedge, smiling faintly to herself. Later that evening, the village had gone half silent after Fiona's death, save for the clatter of cutlery in kitchens and the occasional murmur of gossip carried on the wind. Miss Marple returned to the tea-room, now shuttered for the evening, and spoke quietly with Peggy Lonsdale, the proprietress. "The clock on the parlor wall," Miss Marple said. "Has it ever stopped before?" "Not in the 15 years I've run this place," Peggy replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "Funny thing, that it just stopped ticking at 5:17. I hadn't noticed until someone asked the time after they found poor Fiona." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And who else was inside the tea-room just before that?" "Oh, let me see, Mr. Grange, the solicitor, came in for a take-away slice of Dundee cake, and Mildred Poulton sat in the corner reading. And that Polish fellow Mr. Novak, the violinist, he was tuning up in the corner room, said he'd play a bit before the raffle." "I see." The clock had stopped. A folded note had made a girl pale, and a woman who never lingered had chosen to sit longer than usual, only to die moments later. Miss Marple turned to go. Time had stopped. But something else had started, and Miss Marple, who knew well the odd little undercurrents of human hearts, had no intention of letting it go unnoticed. Section 2. Gossip among the geraniums. By early the next morning, the village of Fern Hollow had begun its quiet dissection of the tragedy. Over marmalade and toast, the news had spread with a strange velocity peculiar to English villages, where facts and speculation tangled like climbing roses through a wrought-iron gate. By dawn, every parlor window fluttered with lace curtains drawn aside just enough to peer through, and every shop bell rang not merely for business, but for conversation. Miss Marple, who had lived in Fern Hollow long enough to know that valuable truths often emerged from half-truths exchanged over fresh bread, made her way to the greengrocer's under the pretense of needing new rhubarb. The morning was fine, dew still glistened on the hedges, and bees hummed lazily around the lavender pots. She wore a pale straw hat and carried her wicker basket, the very image of genteel normalcy. At Hamley's Produce she found what she had expected: Mrs. Edith Fanshawe, spinning her theories like a spider with a tart tongue. "I tell you, Edith was declaring to young Jenny Flax, who was attempting to sort tomatoes by ripeness. It was the strain of the fate. Poor Fiona was far too tightly wound, always making herself busy with committees and accounts. The heart gives out when the nerves won't. Jenny nodded absently, clearly more focused on keeping the tomatoes from bruising. And you heard, of course, about that dreadful little row she had last month with Mr. Grange? Something about the Women's Guild funds. Fiona never did let a matter drop. Did she faint then? Asked Jenny. Collapsed like a stringless puppet. Peggy Lonsdale said she didn't even twitch. Fell back in that garden chair like she'd been turned off with a switch. Most unnatural, really. Miss Marple coughed politely. Good morning, Edith, Jenny. Ah, Miss Marple. You heard the news, then? Edith's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone delivering drama firsthand. I was there. Actually, Miss Marple replied gently, a most unfortunate end. Indeed, and on fete day, too. It's left a sour taste in everyone's mouth. Poor Miss Braithwaite, Miss Marple murmured. I noticed she seemed rather settled just before the end. One wouldn't expect that, would one, in the midst of a heart attack? Edith blinked, then floundered for a reply. Well, shock takes many forms, I'm told. Could have been all internal. Miss Marple nodded as if accepting this, but her eyes moved to the small poster in the shop window. Spring Fete program. 3 p.m. cake judging. 4 p.m. music. Recital. 5 p.m. raffle draw. 5:30 p.m. tea and biscuits in the garden. How curious. Fiona had passed before the final tea. Outside the shop, she encountered Reverend Pritchard, hurrying along with a sheaf of papers in hand. He stopped short at the sight of her. Ah, Miss Marple, yes, awful business yesterday. I still can't quite believe it. Death seldom announces itself conveniently, she replied. Were you there when it happened? Not directly? I was inside finalizing the donations list with Sylvia Cartwright and Mr. Novak. We were short 3 raffle stubs. But then someone screamed, and, well, it was all confusion. Miss Cartwright must be rather shaken. Indeed, she was already under strain. Fiona had well. She'd made things rather uncomfortable. In what way? Reverend Pritchard hesitated. Let us say she had a long memory and a habit of reminding people of it. I can't speak for Sylvia's past, but I know Fiona questioned her return to the village. Miss Marple gave him a brief smile. Yes, I dare say she did. She moved. On. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of overripe wisteria and sun. Me to deliver it only if something unnatural happened to her? Miss Marple raised her brows. And you believe her death was unnatural? Mr. Grange nodded slowly. She didn't die of fright. And I think, though, I can't prove it, that someone didn't want that envelope opened. Miss Marple leaned forward, eyes shining with a spark of quiet fire. Then, perhaps, she said, it's time we open it. Section 5. Ghosts in the ledger by the following morning. The overcast sky had settled over Fern Hollow, like a damp woolen shawl, soft but oppressive. The trees in the churchyard seemed to whisper to one another in the stillness, and the village, for all its modest liveliness, bore the unmistakable hush of unspoken tension. Miss Marple sat in her drawing-room, the recovered ledger page laid beside her tea-tray. She had reread it thrice before dawn. While she'd long suspected there were small crimes tucked between the well-manicured hedges of Fern Hollow, it was rare that they bled into something mortal. A knock came at the door, not brisk, but hesitant like a question asked with fingers. She opened it to find Reverend Pritchard on her step, his eyes a storm of concern. "May I come in, Miss Marple?" he asked, unusually somber. "Of course, Reverend," she said gently, stepping aside. "Do sit. Would you like tea?" He shook his head. No, this isn't a social call, I'm afraid. It's about the church clock. Mildred told me you looked at it yesterday." "I did," Miss Marple said. "Such a handsome old piece. Indeed, and yet there's something odd. Last night I took it apart. I found the lower cabinet ajar. Inside there was dust disturbed. I thought perhaps a mouse had gotten in, but then I found ... this." He reached into his coat pocket and removed a second folded sheet, aged, water-spotted, torn from the same ledger. Miss Marple accepted it calmly. It was a continuation of the record she had already seen, more names, more sums. This time, beside one-line vendor payment, hall decorations, there was a hastily scrawled note, RP to hold until final tally, to be made right later. R.P. Reverend Pritchard watched her closely. "You don't think I had anything to do with it, do you?" Miss Marple gave a small smile. "I think Fiona Braithwaite trusted few people. Perhaps that was wise." He sighed and sat heavily. "I did handle some of the gala funds. Fiona insisted I keep a portion aside to cover a shortfall she claimed would come. I thought she was simply being cautious. I didn't ask questions. She was right, it seems," Miss Marple said, folding the page. "You believe this has to do with her death?" "I believe Fiona believed so. And people who are frightened do not hide things in clocks unless they expect someone may come for them." The vicar clasped his hands. "I fear Fern Hollow is not as innocent as we've let ourselves believe." "Oh, Reverend," Miss Marple said quietly, "no village is." A visit to the past later that morning, Miss Marple made her way through the puddled lanes to the cottage of Iris Ketteridge, Fern Hollow's oldest living resident and its unofficial historian. Iris had not attended. The fate arthritis had kept her to her chair, but she knew everything that happened within half a mile of her front gate. "Fiona Braithwaite?" she said, settling a blanket over her lap. "A firebrand, that one. Never liked being told what to do." "Did she and Sylvia Cartwright always get on?" Miss Marple asked. "They were thick as thieves back in the 80s. Ran the gala together, as I recall. Sylvia was clever with ribbons and flowers. Fiona did the ledgers. But there was a row afterward, nasty business. I don't know the details. But they didn't speak for a year. Did they ever reconcile?" "Publicly, yes, but not really. You can always tell. It was politeness, not forgiveness." "And what of the others involved in the gala?" "Oh, well, let me think. The Pritchards, of course. Edwin was treasurer. And there was Cyril Vane, who did the catering, gone now, poor man. And George Arbuthnot, he was the solicitor before Horace Grange. A pompous man, always quoting legal precedent to justify nonsense. He left Fern Hollow after the gala. Very sudden." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Did he?" Iris nodded. "Moved away to Wiltshire. Fiona always said it was a nervous breakdown, but I don't believe that. I think he knew something, or did something." Sylvia's unease that afternoon Miss Marple found Sylvia Cartwright in the churchyard, bent over a flower arrangement at her late husband's grave. Her hands were trembling, though the air was still. "You came," Sylvia said quietly, not looking up. "I hoped you would." "I always pay my respects," Miss Marple replied. "It's a peaceful spot." Sylvia brushed earth from her gloves. "I haven't slept. I keep thinking, if Fiona hadn't opened her mouth again, ... She might be alive?" Sylvia turned, startled by the bluntness. Miss Marple offered no apology. "I didn't mean that I wished her dead. I mean Fiona had a way of ... prying. She liked exposing people, even when it hurt them, especially when it hurt them." Sylvia sighed. "She told me once that the worst sin isn't lying, it's cowardice. That I was a coward. I didn't argue, because you agreed." "With her?" Sylvia gave a sad smile. "I'm not proud of everything I've done." Miss Marple placed a gloved hand on Sylvia's arm. "The truth has a way of emerging even after decades, especially in places like this." Sylvia looked away. "I think someone's watching." M.E. "Oh, I keep hearing a click when I'm on the phone. Footsteps outside at night. At first I thought I was imagining it, but ... Has anyone come to speak with you about Fiona's will?" Sylvia hesitated. "Not officially, but Mr. Grange hinted I should prepare myself. He said Fiona had named me her sole heir." Miss Marple nodded. "That doesn't surprise. But it's ridiculous. I didn't even want anything from her, not after all these years. Someone else may want it, or may want to prevent something else from being discovered." Sylvia swallowed. "Do you think I'm in danger?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that whoever killed Fiona may be desperate, and desperation is a dangerous thing." The sound of midnight that evening. Miss Marple returned home as the street lamps flickered to life across the village green. She lit a small coal fire and sat in her wingback chair, the velvet pouch with the ribbon-marked R.P. once more in her lap. She turned it over slowly. Then came a sound soft but distinct. A creak on the gravel outside her cottage. Miss Marple stood, moving quietly toward the window. Through the lace curtain she saw a figure retreating down the lane, tall, dark coat. A swift, but not panicked, pace. A man, she thought, though, too. Far to be sure. On her stoop she found a single envelope, unmarked. Inside, a faded photograph. The 1984 Gala Committee. Smiling faces. Fiona, Sylvia, Reverend Pritchard, and a man Miss Marple did not recognize. On the back, in Fiona's handwriting, one of them knows. One of them killed her. Look closer at what's missing. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Indeed," she said aloud, "the truth is not in what is shown. It's in what someone made sure we didn't see." Section 6. Shadows in the frame morning light returned to Fern Hollow with a thin silver gleam. The mist, pale and curling, clung low to the hedgerows, veiling the lanes in silence. Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table with the photograph spread before her like a map of secrets. 7 people in the picture. Fiona Braithwaite stood in the center, her shoulders square, the expression on her face just shy of a smile, confident, knowing. Sylvia Cartwright was to her left, her gaze not quite meeting the camera. To Fiona's right stood Reverend Pritchard, younger then but already solemn. 3 others stood at the back, A woman with a double string of pearls whom Miss Marple recognized faintly as Mrs. Dorothea Woodcroft, now long deceased. A man, N.A., smart Westcott Edwin Pritchard, the Reverend's elder cousin. And finally, on the far left, a man with a stiff collar and a guarded smile. The seventh figure dot, she turned the photo again, examining the edges. It had been torn carefully. A piece missing, someone had been cut out. She frowned. Not just cropped, but removed meticulously. No jagged edge, no hasty snip. This was deliberate, as if to erase someone not just from the photograph, but from memory itself. Who? A question of absence at 10:30. Miss Marple made her way to the village post office, where Miss Letty Hornbeam presided not only over stamps and telegrams, but over a stream of whispered knowledge. Miss Marple? Letty chirped, adjusting her spectacles. A fine morning, if one discounts the lingering fog of intrigue. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, sliding the photograph across the counter. I wonder, Miss Hornbeam, would you mind identifying this for me? I recognize all but one of the gentlemen. Letty peered closely, then tutted. Oh my, that's the old gala committee. Goodness, I'd forgotten all about this. That's Edwin, of course, and Dorothea and Fiona, dear me. And the man in the waistcoat? Mr. Vane, Cyril Vane. He catered the fete for years. Wonderful chutneys. Died of a stroke in 1996. And the gentleman on the far left? Letty squinted harder. Oh, that was young Mr. Jonathan Braithwaite. Jonathan? Miss Marple's brow lifted. Fiona's nephew? Her brother's son, yes. Moved abroad, Canada, I think. He had, well, something of a falling out with the family. Over what? Letty leaned in. There were rumors of embez. It wasn't made public. Quiet matters rarely are in Fern Hollow. But Fiona was furious. Said he'd betrayed the family trust. I see. Did he ever return? No, not to my knowledge. Not after 85. Fiona never mentioned him again, and his name was never spoken in the village, as if he'd vanished. Miss Marple nodded, storing the name away like a bead on a string. Someone had cut him from the photograph dot, but not from Fiona's memory. The solicitor's silence that afternoon. Miss Marple called upon Mr. Horace Grange, solicitor and custodian of much of Fern Hollow's old paper trail. His offices were musty, his waistcoat immaculate, and his discomfort upon seeing the photograph unmistakable. I'd rather hope this wouldn't resurface, he murmured, accepting a cup of weak tea from his secretary and guiding Miss Marple into his private office. Where did you get this? On my doorstep, Miss Marple said mildly. Curious timing, wouldn't you say? Just days after Fiona's death. Mr. Grange nodded stiffly. Jonathan Braithwaite was struck from all official family documents at Fiona's request. It was quite unorthodox, but she insisted. Do you know why? I could guess, but I shouldn't say. Miss Marple sipped her tea. You're worried Fiona's will might be contested. That depends, he said with the faintest wince, on whether Jonathan is still alive. Is he? Mr. Grange hesitated. There was a letter, he said, 2 months ago. Fiona came to me, white as chalk. She didn't show me the letter. Itself only the envelope. Canadian postmark. Said he was returning. Returning? She feared he meant to reclaim what he'd once stolen, or expose something best left buried. And now Fiona is dead. Grange paled. You think it's connected? I think Fiona believed she was living on borrowed time. She trusted the clock more than the law. And clocks, well, they're very particular about what they keep. A walked through shadows later as dusk began to seep across the lanes of Fern Hollow. Miss Marple walked along the cobbled lane toward the Braithwaite house, now shuttered, a dark hole on the landscape. She paused before its black iron gate. The garden was overgrown, weeds tangling the path. Yet someone had been here recently. The soil was disturbed, a boot print deep fresh, not the tidy shoes of Sylvia Cartwright or the careful steps of the Reverend. Someone heavier, someone furtive. Miss Marple did not enter. Instead, she turned down the path toward the old smithy, where Constable Green was still stationed. "I wonder," she said cheerily, "might you indulge an old woman with a peek at the house's visitor's log?" Green blinked. "What log?" Oh, surely you keep track of who's come and gone since the tragedy?" He looked sheepish. "Not formally, ma'am, but I've made notes." Miss Marple smiled. "May I?" He handed over a lined notepad. Miss Marple scanned it slowly. Sylvia Cartwright twice. Reverend Pritchard once. Mr. Grange once. And on the previous evening, a scrawled entry. Unknown male. Approx. 50s. Entered grounds. Seen leaving at 9:42 p.m. No interaction. She pointed. "Did you speak to him?" Green shook his head. "I saw him from a distance. Tall, gray coat, no vehicle." "Did he see you?" "I don't think so." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts whirring like a ticking mechanism. Someone had returned. Someone Fiona had once tried to forget. Echoes of guilt. That night, alone by her hearth, Miss Marple laid out everything before her. The 2 pages from the hidden ledger, the photograph, the solicitor's notes, and the anonymous envelope. She noticed it then on the back of the ledger's final page. In faint pencil script, "Jonathan knows about 1984. I warned Edwin. If anything happens to me, start with the clock." A simple sentence. A desperate one. Miss Marple's eyes closed briefly. So much of crime, she reflected, was not about cruelty. It was about fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of loss. Fear of justice after too many years of silence. And fear, when cornered, turned even the most respectable villagers into something deadly. Section 7. The pattern. Beneath the porcelain Sunday arrived in Fern Hollow, beneath a silver sky, the kind that promised drizzle without ever delivering it. The village church bell rang out solemnly, ushering the morning congregation into St. Winifred's like moths to a candle. The air, though fresh, carried the weight of quiet unease, whispers caught between hymns and glances more loaded than prayers. Miss Marple, dressed in a dove-gray coat with a forget-me-not brooch on her lapel, took her usual place at the end of the second pew. From her vantage, she could see them all, the mourners and suspects, the pious and the hypocrites, singing from the same hymn sheet, but each carrying a different burden. Sylvia Cartwright sat stiffly beside her husband Clive, the corners of her mouth tight as though holding back a sob or perhaps something else. Reverend Pritchard, composed as always, gave a sermon about the nature of time and its moral reckoning. Miss Marple noted the tremor in his hand as he turned the page. A man of the cloth, yes, but not a man at peace. Edwin Pritchard stood near the font, having arrived late, his coat damp with fog. He didn't sing. He didn't bow his head. He stared blankly ahead, like someone listening for a sound. Only he could hear Dot, and in the back pew, unnoticed by most, sat a man in a charcoal coat with a travel-worn hat pressed between his hands. Miss Marple saw him. Dot. So did Sylvia, whose hand tightened suddenly on her handbag. Got an unexpected return. The man in the back row did not come forward for communion. He lingered, then departed quietly through the side door. Miss Marple allowed 5 minutes to pass before she too rose, murmuring polite goodbyes, and made her way outside. She found him near the churchyard yews, smoking a cigarette with a hand that trembled faintly. He turned as she approached. "You must be Miss Marple, and you must be Mr. Jonathan Braithwaite," he nodded. "It's strange, I half expected someone else." "You were hoping to see your aunt? She wouldn't have welcomed me. I wrote her months ago, but she never replied." Miss Marple studied him. Mid-50s, deep lines around his eyes, the weathered complexion of someone who had not lived gently. Yet there was a quiet sorrow to him, not guilt, but regret. "She received your letter," Miss Marple said gently. "She told her solicitor you were coming. Did you know she passed?" Jonathan nodded. "I saw the obituary in the Evening Chronicle. That's why I came. Were you at the house?" He didn't answer at once. "I went to look," he said finally. "Stood in the garden for all of 5 minutes. Then left. Thought better of it. Someone saw you. I thought they might. I wasn't hiding." "Not really." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Not really." Tea with intentions. An hour later, Miss Marple hosted a modest tea at her cottage. She had sent out invitations to 3 people, Sylvia Cartwright, Edwin Pritchard, and Jonathan Braithwaite. Only Edwin accepted in person. Sylvia responded via note. Jonathan, surprisingly, arrived early. They were an odd trio. Jonathan, weary and reflective. Edwin, cagey and defensive. And Sylvia, who swept in with a brittle elegance that barely concealed her nerves. Miss Marple served lemon sponge and strong Assam tea in delicate cups, blue with gold trim. Conversation remained light until Miss Marple set down the photograph. "I found this," she said mildly, "left on my doorstep. Quite a charming image, though I noticed someone had been rather cruelly cropped from it." Sylvia's hand trembled as she lifted her cup. "I've not seen that photo in years," Edwin scowled. "Why bring this up now?" Jonathan remained silent. "Because," Miss Marple continued, "memories are very much like old clocks. When they stop, one must ask not only what time they ceased, but why." There was a stillness. Then Sylvia said, "My father hated secrets?" Miss Marple looked at her. "Your father?" Sylvia hesitated, lips thinning. Fiona was his sister. She never forgave him for the Jonathan affair. Jonathan blinked. "Affair? She thought he protected you." Jonathan frowned. "He did no such thing." "He did," Sylvia snapped. "He convinced her not to press charges. Said you were young, stupid, and it would ruin you. I didn't steal from her." Miss Marple leaned forward. "What did happen in 1984? Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I found something I wasn't meant to find. A ledger. It listed donations for the village fete, but some of the figures didn't add up. I asked Fiona. She told me never to speak of it again. A week later, I was accused of taking £400 from the house account." "And did you?" Sylvia asked. Coldly. Jonathan met her gaze. No, but I couldn't prove otherwise. Fiona controlled everything, and my father, your father, begged me to go quietly. Edwin muttered, "It was ancient history." Fiona moved on. Did she? Miss Marple asked. Then why was her clock altered? Edwin looked up, startled. She left a message, Miss Marple continued, hidden in the ledger. She knew something was coming. A rattle at the window, the tea, was interrupted by a tap at the parlor window. Constable Green stood outside, looking flustered. Miss Marple excused herself and joined him on the step. "We've had a development," he said. Fiona's will was tampered with. Miss Marple tilted her head. Tampered? The safe was forced. Someone switched the document. A new version cuts Jonathan out entirely. Miss Marple's eyes darkened. And the original? Gone. She turned back to her guests, all of whom now sat with tense expressions and unspoken questions. The room, once warm with sponge cake and polite lies, had turned quite cold. Pieces fall into place later that evening. Miss Marple sat with her knitting by the fire, her needles moving slowly as thoughts tangled and unraveled in equal measure. Fiona's message. Start with the clock. The doctored will. A man erased from a photograph, then a legacy. A family at war, bound by secrets, unspoken debts, and the corrosive power of silence. And one more. Thread something Edwin had said during tea. Fiona moved on. Yet Fiona hadn't moved on. She'd written warnings. She'd prepared for betrayal, Dot, so if the will was changed, who benefited? Not Sylvia, who was already heir, not Jonathan, now excluded. Not the Reverend, he was never mentioned, but Edwin. The old photograph whispered again. 7 figures, but only 6 remained. 1 was missing in memory, and perhaps in conscience. Section 8. Miss Marple's final test fern. Hollow had grown unusually quiet in the days that followed. The late September wind, dry and murmuring, fluttered through the hedgerows and bent the wisteria vines that climbed the vicarage wall. The church clock had been repaired, chiming again in perfect rhythm, but the mystery of another clock, the small jade one from Fiona Braithwaite's parlor, remained uncomfortably out of time. That Miss Marple had said very little publicly since the tea gathering. She had offered no conclusions, no accusations, only quiet nods, a smile at the post office, a lingering gaze through her lace curtains. But in the parlor of her cottage, her knitting needles had not moved for 2 days. Instead, she studied people. Their reactions, their silences, their routines altered ever so slightly. And now she was ready. An invitation to Unai's by Thursday morning. Handwritten invitations delivered discreetly by Constable Green had been sent to 5 individuals, Sylvia and Clive, Cartwright, Edwin Pritchard, Jonathan Braithwaite, and Reverend Pritchard. The note was politely worded, even affectionate, inviting them to afternoon tea at Miss Marple's cottage. Nothing formal, it read, but I believe a few questions may be settled with cordiality and a good cup of tea. Sylvia arrived, precisely on time, Clive trailing dutifully behind. She wore a plum-colored wool dress with a matching hat, too formal for an ordinary visit. Her face was drawn but composed. Jonathan arrived next, hat in hand, dressed plainly. He looked tired, but less guarded than before. Edwin came late, muttering apologies and avoiding eye contact with nearly everyone. The Reverend entered last, looking flustered, muttering something about sacred time poorly kept. Miss Marple, serene in a pale mauve cardigan and a silver teapot between her hands, welcomed them each as if they were old friends rather than pieces on a board now nearing checkmate. The clock on the mantel-tea was served with sponge cake and a bowl of damson jam. Conversation remained light for the first 10 minutes, until Miss Marple rose and moved toward the fireplace. Before we indulge in second helpings, she said with a pleasant smile, "I should like to share something." From the mantel, she took down Fiona Braithwaite's jade clock, its polished green body gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. She turned it to face the room. "As you can see," Miss Marple said, "this clock stopped at precisely 2:47. A curious time, considering Fiona was known to wind it every morning at 9. Sylvia glanced at her husband, frowning. Clive looked down at his teacup. Edwin stiffened. "A coincidence, surely." "I'm afraid not," Miss Marple replied, gently. "You see, Fiona kept that clock not for decoration, but to time her midday medicines. It had sentimental value. It was a wedding gift from her late husband, and she never failed to mention how reliable it was. For it to stop on the very day she died, and precisely 13 minutes before she was found, raises troubling questions." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "Are you saying someone tampered with it?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and very precisely. The back casing shows a faint scuff. Someone stopped it manually." The room grew quiet. "Why would anyone do that?" Sylvia asked, though her voice was faint. "To fabricate an alibi," Miss Marple answered softly. "To make the time of death appear different than it truly was. And since only one person in this room had both access to the study and intimate knowledge of Fiona's habits." She paused, letting the moment stretch like a taut string. "It narrows things considerably, unmasking tensions." "Really, Miss Marple," Edwin said, voice rising, "are we to play guessing games? If you have something to say it plainly." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "But I find the indirect approach most revealing. For instance, Reverend Pritchard, do you recall when you first noted the missing will?" The Reverend blinked. Yes. I was at the house with Edwin after Fiona's passing." "Yes. And Mr. Pritchard," she turned to Edwin now, "you told Constable Green you were in the sitting room at the time, inspecting the bookshelf." Edwin nodded stiffly. "And yet," Miss Marple went on, "the fingerprints found on the safe belonged to only one person." Sylvia's eyes widened. "Yours." Edwin's face flushed a dangerous red. "That means nothing," he snapped. "I was her solicitor. Of course I accessed the safe often, but not recently," Miss Marple said. "The dust had settled over the lock until the day of her death." Jonathan leaned forward. "She knew. Fiona knew someone was going to tamper with her affairs." "She did," Miss Marple said. "Hence the clock. Hence the message to her solicitor meant to draw attention not to the will, but to the moment the deception occurred." Sylvia stood suddenly. "Why, Edwin? You were her nephew." "I was her servant," Edwin spat. "She kept me on a leash. For 30 years doling out scraps, humiliating me in front of village fools. Do you know how many times she'd promised to name me heir, then changed her mind?" Clive Cartwright rose to steady his wife, but Sylvia did not retreat. "You changed the will?" she asked quietly. "I restored justice." Miss Marple folded her hands. "But you did more than that, didn't you? You confronted her." "She refused." to sign the version you brought. You panicked. When she collapsed, you let it happen, perhaps even helped it along. Poison? Clive asked, horrified. No, Miss Marple said. A stroke, according to the doctor. But the circumstances fear, the stress, the betrayal, it accelerated what might have taken months. And you ensured the clock told a different story. Edwin's eyes narrowed. You can't prove that. No, Miss Marple said softly, but guilt has a curious habit of proving itself. And as Edwin turned away, as if seeking escape, through the parlor curtains, Sylvia took a single step forward. You didn't just rob her, Edwin, she said coldly. You made sure the past stayed buried. You destroyed every truth that made our family worth remembering. Silence. Then Reverend Pritchard murmured, Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. Miss Marple nodded. A gentle conclusion, Constable. Green arrived minutes later, discreetly taking Edwin into custody, not for murder, but for will forgery and fraud. The rest, Miss Marple suspected, would unfold in the courts. But Fiona Braithwaite's death no longer whispered secrets into the fog. Sylvia left with her husband, hand in hand for the first time in weeks. Jonathan lingered, his expression a mixture of sadness and relief. She was difficult, my aunt, he said to Miss Marple, but she deserved peace. She has it now, Miss Marple said gently, and so I think does Fern Hollow. The clock on her mantel ticked in quiet rhythm. Outside, the wind finally died, and the wisteria stilled. Section 9. Echoes through the drawing room by the next morning. News of Edwin Pritchard's arrest had flown through Fern Hollow like a sharp wind through brittle hedgerows. Villagers passed the tidings along with their sugar bowls and marmalade pots, each version growing slightly more colorful than the last. In Mrs. Crampton's tea room, the butcher's wife whispered that Edwin had forged a dozen wills. At the stationer's, young Peter Hall swore he saw Edwin toss documents into the brook behind the vicarage. And at the post office, Miss Tansley, who knew absolutely nothing, managed to imply everything. Yet at the center of the storm, Miss Marple remained characteristically still. She spent the morning tending to her roses and sipping weak China tea with a slice of lemon. But beneath her calm, something still troubled her, an itch at the back of her mind. Edwin may have tampered with the will. He may even have frightened Fiona Braithwaite enough to contribute to her collapse. But Miss Marple, who knew human nature like the back of her hand-knitted glove, could not yet call the matter settled. No, there was one more layer still waiting, just beneath the surface. Something unsaid, something unfinished. The reverberations of guilt at mid-morning. Sylvia Cartwright appeared at Miss Marple's cottage unannounced. She stood stiffly at the threshold, as though unsure whether she had come to speak or to confess. Miss Marple ushered her in with quiet grace. I don't know why I'm here, Sylvia said after a long pause. Most people never do, dear, Miss Marple replied, until they begin speaking. They sat in the parlor, tea untouched between them. I keep thinking about the letter, Sylvia said, the one Fiona left. She wrote about someone coming for her, not Edwin. Someone she trusted once. Someone she never thought would. Her voice faltered. Miss Marple waited. Fiona never trusted easily, Sylvia went on. She tested people. She made you jump through hoops just to earn her approval. But there were lines she didn't cross, especially when it came to family. Miss Marple studied her gently. And yet she altered her will to cut out Jonathan. Sylvia's face darkened. But did she? Truly? I wonder if Edwin was only part of it. There was silence, broken only by the gentle ticking of the jade clock on Miss Marple's side table. She seemed frightened in the weeks before, Sylvia said, her voice barely above a whisper. More than I've ever seen her, Clive thought. It was just age, but I saw the way she double-locked her doors, the way she looked over her shoulder. Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-loop, and after Jonathan arrived, she asked quietly. Sylvia hesitated. He said he never saw her, but I'm not sure. I believe him. A walk along the river path that afternoon, Miss Marple walked with Reverend Pritchard along the footpath behind the vicarage, where the river whispered against its banks. She was fond of you, she said. The Reverend, who had seemed composed for most of the week, stopped walking. I was her confessor, not her friend. You were both, I think, which is why I'm asking. Did she confide in you about anything unusual before her death? The Reverend looked up at the gray sky, then slowly shook his head. Nothing explicit, but she left hints. Worries about the house, about the past repeating itself. She didn't name anyone, but she feared someone would try to take what wasn't theirs. Miss Marple nodded. I suspect she saw more than she let on. That was always her gift and her downfall. They continued in silence until they reached a stile that led down to the river bend. There a single yellow scarf had been snagged. In the brambles, Miss Marple stopped. Is that? The Reverend began. Miss Marple reached for it. The scarf was silken bright, and patterned with small red tulips. Familiar. Sylvia had worn it during tea 2 days before Fiona's death. A discovery at the vicarage that evening, Miss Marple paid an unexpected visit to the vicarage. Reverend. Pritchard answered the door again, but this time she asked for Edwin's study. I understand he kept meticulous files, she said. I'd like to see them. The vicar hesitated, then led her down the narrow hall to the modest room, still, smelling of ink and lemon oil. The papers had been hastily boxed after Edwin's arrest, but his file cabinet remained. With the Reverend's permission, Miss Marple sifted through one drawer after another, mostly property deeds, correspondence, and invoices. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a faded parish ledger, she found a small envelope. It was addressed to Edwin. Inside was a single sheet, typed, double quotes, you and I both know the truth about 1984. If you think you can bury it forever, think again. No signature, no date, Miss Marple stared at it, her lips pressed thin. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. A note like this was not left lightly, nor was it written by someone with idle threats. She looked back to the Reverend. This was meant to frighten him. Someone knew what he did, or thought they did. The Reverend was pale. Do you think Sylvia? Miss Marple didn't answer. She was already returning the drawer to order. Her mind was elsewhere, on the scarf by the river, the jade clocks scratched back, and the peculiar thing Jonathan had said about not entering the house. A visit at dusk that night, just as the sun dipped beneath the thatched roofs of Fern Hollow and the shadows thickened across the lane. Jonathan Braithwaite came knocking at Miss Marple's door. I need to speak with you, he said, alone. She invited him in, and this time offered no tea. They sat across from one another, the clock ticking between them. "I lied," he said simply. "I did go into the house. On the day Fiona died." Miss Marple waited. "I let myself in through the back. The door was unlocked. I found her in the study. She was already gone." "And why didn't you come forward?" "Because I panicked. I thought she died of shock because of me. I'd come to ask for forgiveness." And there she was, lying on the rug, the jade clock next to her. "I didn't know what to do." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And the will?" Jonathan hesitated. "I didn't touch it." "You saw it?" "Yes, it was on her desk, still unsigned. That's how I knew she'd meant to restore me to the will. It was the old version, the one naming me. But now—" He trailed off. Miss Marple looked at him long and quietly. And then, at last, she asked, "What else are you not telling me?" "Mr. Braithwaite?" His face tightened, but he said nothing. Not yet. Section 10. A Game of Shadows. The next morning in Fern Hollow dawned hushed and overcast, as if the village itself was holding its breath. Church Lane remained quiet. Only the occasional whinny from the vicarage stables disturbed the cool air. But inside Miss Marple's drawing room, a storm had begun to gather. Miss Marple sat alone by her window, her knitting untouched in her lap. She stared not at the needles or the growing scarf of pale blue wool, but at the jade clock on her mantelpiece, nearly identical to the one that had fallen beside Fiona Braithwaite's body. She had turned it over once again that morning, inspecting the slight nick on its brass hinge. So easily overlooked, so easily faked. The scent of lavender still lingered faintly on the envelope she had retrieved from Edwin's drawer the night before, tucked now into the drawer of her writing desk. Someone had known something. Someone had pushed Fiona Braithwaite to the brink and possibly beyond. And now Jonathan Braithwaite, the prodigal son with quiet eyes and fraying cuffs, had confessed to a visit he had previously denied. Yet even in his honesty there was something missing, a hesitation, an omission. Not quite deceitful but protective. Of what or of whom? Miss Marple rose from her chair and made her way to the hall. She reached for her coat and parasol, not for protection against the weather, but because appearances mattered in Fern Hollow. One never walked into a home unannounced unless one looked entirely innocent in doing so. And she had someone to visit. A visit to the widow Shale-Misses. Imogen Shale, Fiona's closest friend, and, some whispered, her oldest rival, lived in a handsome Georgian house that backed onto the meadow near St. Mildred's. She had been curiously absent from village gossip the past week, an odd thing. For a woman who had once run the social committee with an iron fist and a velvet glove, she opened the door herself, wearing a lavender cardigan and a guarded smile. "Miss Marple." "What a surprise!" "You're really surprised, Mrs. Shale," Miss Marple said gently, "though I dare say you're often very good at pretending to be." Imogen's smile stiffened. They sat in a conservatory filled with spider plants and a faint smell of stale Madeira cake. Fiona's death was sudden, Miss Marple said. Imogen blinked, pouring tea into her cup without offering one to her guest. "I suppose it was," she said flatly, though not entirely unexpected. She hadn't been herself for months. "You mean since Jonathan returned?" "No, long before that." "Since—" Imogen paused, then waved a hand. "Since the business with the housekeeper." The one they dismissed in '84. Ah, yes, Miss Marple said smoothly. Miss Holloway. Imogen stared. You remember her? Not personally, but I remember the time. I remember things being unsettled. Miss Marple let the silence stretch. Then, just before it grew too long. I wonder, she said, if Fiona ever confided in you about what happened. Imogen hesitated. Only that there was a disagreement. Something she found out after the fact. Fiona never forgave betrayals. Indeed, Miss Marple said softly. But sometimes when we fear scandal more than truth, we forgive things we shouldn't and punish those who don't deserve it. Imogen didn't respond, but her knuckles whitened around her teacup. A subtle invitation. That afternoon, Miss Marple arranged a small gathering at her cottage under the polite pretense of a farewell tea for Reverend Pritchard, who had announced he would be taking a short sabbatical to reflect in Cornwall. A few of the villagers gathered Sylvia Cartwright, the Reverend young Peter Howe, Mrs. Shale, and Jonathan Braithwaite, who had appeared without needing to be asked. The air was thick, with pleasantries and poorly disguised anxiety. Everyone knew what was unsaid. Fiona Braithwaite's death still hung over the village like a cloud no amount of tea could dispel. Miss Marple kept the conversation light, drifting between lace-making techniques and St. Mildred's leaky bell tower. But her eyes missed nothing. Not the glance Jonathan gave Imogen Shale when she mentioned Fiona's letter-writing habit. Not the way Sylvia twisted her handkerchief when she laughed too loudly. Eventually, Miss Marple stood and moved to the mantelpiece, where the jade clock still ticked its rhythm. It's strange, isn't it? She said, the way a clock can hold so much meaning. I've always found timepieces rather poetic. They witness everything and say nothing. She turned and faced the room. Everyone had gone still. Fiona Braithwaite's clock stopped at 12:17, or so the coroner believed. But clocks, especially antique ones, can be set, tampered with, dropped. No one spoke. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle. I once knew a woman who tried to make her husband's death look like a robbery. She moved the mantel clock forward to give herself an alibi, but she hadn't accounted for the fact that the clock's chime had been broken for weeks. And so, her alibi fell apart because no one heard the strike she claimed to hear. Reverend Pritchard looked away. Jonathan cleared his throat. I wonder, Miss Marple said, moving toward the tea table, how many of us noticed that Fiona's jade clock had a very faint scratch on the base. Too faint to ma. Unless, of course, it wasn't the original clock at all. Sylvia gasped. Miss Marple turned to her. You wore a tulip scarf the day Fiona died. I found it by the river path behind the house. Sylvia's lips trembled. I dropped it. I often walk that way. Miss Marple held up a hand. I believe you. But someone else picked it up, thinking it might make a useful diversion. She returned her gaze to the clock. There was a switch. The original clock was taken, perhaps by someone who knew it would tell a different time than they needed. Perhaps by someone who wanted to confuse the investigation. The silence grew, deeper still, and then Miss Marple smiled. I dare say we'll know the truth quite soon. Nightfall and resolve that evening, Jonathan Braithwaite returned to Miss Marple's cottage. He looked tired, his jacket rumpled. I know, you know, he said. Miss Marple nodded. I suspect, but I'm not certain. Not yet. "She didn't deserve it," he said, voice low. "No one ever truly does," Miss Marple replied. He slumped into the chair across from her. "It wasn't the money," he said. "It was everything she'd held over us. For years, she destroyed people, with whispers, with innuendo." Miss Marple waited. "It was Imogen," he said suddenly. "She was there that day. They argued about something old, something buried." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Something to do with Holloway?" she asked. Jonathan gave a short, bitter laugh. "Yes, and with me." Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched beside her teacup. "Then," she said softly, "I believe it's time we had one last conversation with Mrs. Shale." Section 11. The Truth Hidden in Plain Sight. The following morning, the sky over. Fern Hollow was an uninterrupted sheet of pewter gray, pressing down on the village like a heavy lid. A chill hung in the air despite the late spring blossoms, and the streets were nearly deserted save for a few early walkers and the sound of a milk cart rattling past Miss Marple's front gate. Inside she stood by her window, observing the comings and goings with a calm, measured patience. Her parlor had been prepared carefully. A fresh tea service was laid out on the table, the lace antimacassars straightened, the jade clock polished and returned to the mantel. She had sent a brief note to Mrs. Imogen Shale that morning, requesting her company for a cup of tea. There had been no reply, but Miss Marple was not the sort to be left waiting long. At precisely 11 minutes past 11, Imogen arrived. She stepped into the drawing-room with the air of a woman who had convinced herself this was a simple social visit. "Miss Marple," she said briskly, glancing around as she removed her gloves, "I wasn't sure I ought to come. So many strange things going about these days." "Strange indeed," Miss Marple said, "but tea helps." Imogen offered a polite smile. She was pale today, dressed in a high-necked navy blouse that made her look almost funereal. Miss Marple poured, her motions unhurried. She added a slice of lemon to Imogen's cup, and she had always preferred, "I suppose you've heard that Jonathan's been talking to the constable," Imogen said with a forced casualness. Miss Marple stirred her own cup. "Yes, I believe. He has begun to recall things he previously kept to himself." "I imagine he's quite distressed," Imogen said. "It must be overwhelming, returning here after all this time. So many old ghosts." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Ghosts have a way of lingering when we leave unfinished business behind. The memory of 1984. They sipped their tea in silence for a few moments. The tick of the jade clock filled the space between their words. "You knew Fiona a long time, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked. Imogen glanced up. "Nearly 30 years. You were close even in the difficult times." "We were, yes. And yet," Miss Marple continued gently, "you weren't among those mentioned in her will." Imogen's teacup paused midway to her lips. "No," she said after a moment. "Fiona and I, we drifted apart in recent years." "Was it because of what happened with Miss Holloway?" A flicker passed across Imogen's face, quick as a cloud across the sun, but noticeable to someone like Miss Marple. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Miss Marple said, her tone still mild. "Fiona was terribly proud. She never wanted the village to know that her former housekeeper, so devoted, so helpful, had once been arrested for blackmail. But of course you knew. You had helped cover it up." Imogen set her cup down with a sharp clink. "That's an ugly accusation." Not at all, Miss Marple replied evenly. It's merely an observation. When one looks back at the timing, at the whispers surrounding the Braithwaite household that summer, it begins to make sense. You tried to protect Fiona, and perhaps yourself. Imogen was silent for a long time. Yes, she said at last. We thought it would be contained. Fiona paid her off-hush money. Really. And I swore I'd keep it. Quiet. But Fiona never truly forgave betrayal, Miss Marple murmured. No, she never did. Miss Marple's quiet trap Miss Marple refilled the teapot. I've been thinking, she said almost dreamily, about how peculiar it was that Fiona's clock was broken. Such a robust piece, too. It must have taken quite a forceful drop. It might have been accidental, Imogen said, her voice cautious. Perhaps. But clocks don't stop at precisely the same time as a sudden heart failure, unless someone wants us to think they do. A long silence followed. You believe Edwin smashed the clock? Imogen asked. To tamper with the time of death? I believe someone replaced it entirely, Miss Marple said, her gaze fixed not on Imogen, but on the flicker of her reflection in the teapot's silver curve. You see, I have Fiona's real jade clock. Sylvia found it hidden behind the potting, shed wrapped in a red silk scarf and buried beneath garden netting. Such an odd place to conceal something, unless you intended to recover it later. Imogen's lips parted in protest, but no sound came. Miss Marple continued softly. The replacement clock was an identical make, but there was no dust in the grooves. It had been polished clean. The original, however, bore an inscription on the base to Fiona from L.W. dated 1965, a gift from her late husband. A sentimental item, I imagine. She would never part with it unless it was taken from her. Imogen's hands trembled. Faintly in her lap, I think Fiona intended to expose someone. I think she was tired of secrets of protecting people who had failed her. She wasn't well, Imogen said abruptly. You didn't know her as I did? No, Miss Marple agreed. I knew her differently. And I know when a woman is frightened enough to rewrite her will, restore her estranged son, and confide in her vicar all in a fortnight. That is a woman preparing for war. Imogen's voice dropped. She was going to destroy everything. She was going to tell the truth, Miss Marple said, meeting her eyes, about Jonathan, about the real paternity, about Holloway, about what happened in 1984, and she was going to name you in it. The air between them felt thin, stretched taut like a high violin string. Imogen whispered, I didn't mean for it to happen like that. Miss Marple leaned forward. What did happen? The final threads. I went to the house, Imogen said, her voice barely audible, to stop her, to talk sense into her, but she wouldn't listen. She told me she had already posted a letter to her solicitor that Jonathan would inherit everything, that all my sacrifices meant nothing. She said I was no better than the others. I lost my temper. You struck her? No, never. I shouted. She collapsed. I thought she was fainting. I didn't know it would be the end. Miss Marple remained still, but her eyes searched Imogen's. I panicked. I thought if they believed she died naturally, there would be no scandal, no investigation. So I took the clock, swapped it with the spare from my attic. I knew hers had an inscription. I knew they'd look. And I wrapped the real, one in that scarf, and buried it. I thought it was harmless. "There's no such thing," Miss Marple said gently, "as a harmless deception." Imogen's composure crumbled at last. She covered her face, shoulders shaking. Miss Marple stood. Quietly, she reached for the bell pull, then hesitated. "I believe," she said softly, "that you didn't intend to kill her, but you meant to silence her. And in doing so, you let a dozen other lies grow larger." A quiet knock sounded at the door. It was Constable Finch. "I believe Mrs. Shale would like to make a statement," Miss Marple said. Section 12. Whispers. From the attic, the following day dawned quiet and subdued in St. Mildred's Mead, the village awash with that peculiar stillness that follows in the wake of an arrest. It was the sort of silence not born of peace, but of watchfulness, the kind that settles over a place that has been shaken at its foundations and is now waiting nervously to see where the dust will fall. Miss Marple, however, moved through the day with her usual composure. Her morning had been spent attending to correspondence, darning an old linen handkerchief, and offering a brief word of condolence to young Sylvia Braithwaite, who had appeared on her doorstep looking pale and untethered. "She loved you, you know," Sylvia had murmured before departing. "Fiona, even at her worst. You were always the one she respected." Miss Marple had not replied with sentiment, but only with a faint smile and a squeeze of the girl's hand. It was not the time for speeches. What occupied her mind as she sipped her midday tea was a detail, something that still itched beneath the surface of the case. Imogen Shale had admitted to her role in the clock deception. She had confessed to visiting Fiona on the day of her death, had admitted her panic and fear and the selfish impulse to hide the evidence. It was a crime, yes, but one born from desperation rather than malice. Miss Marple had no doubt that Imogen had acted alone in hiding the jade clock, but she had equal certainty that Imogen had not told the entire truth. There was still a missing thread. A quiet visit to the vicarage later that afternoon. Miss Marple walked to the vicarage. The narrow gravel path that led through the churchyard crackled softly under her shoes. The wisteria vines along the stone wall hung low and full, their lavender blossoms swaying in the breeze like secrets whispered too late. Reverend Prowse greeted her at the door, looking distinctly frazzled. "Oh, Miss Marple, forgive me, I haven't tidied the study since the constable's last visit." "No need at all," Miss Marple said kindly, removing her gloves. "I'm not here to inspect, only to inquire." "Inquire?" He blinked behind his spectacles. "About the case? About the missing correspondence. The one Fiona Braithwaite supposedly sent to her solicitor. Do you remember, Mr. Prowse? She told you she had written it and even mentioned she might update her will." "Yes, indeed. She was most firm about it," he said. "Said she'd posted it herself, too, and yet no such letter arrived." "No," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "The solicitor says he received nothing at all." Miss Marple pursed her lips, which makes one wonder, was the letter truly posted? Or was it intercepted? Prowse frowned, then looked suddenly uneasy. "You suspect the mail? Oh dear. That would implicate Mr. Everly, but he's been with the post for 20 years. Trustworthy as the day is long." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "People are rarely only one thing, Mr. Prowse." She stayed for a brief cup of tea, noting how nervous the vicar became whenever Fiona's name came up. She did not press him further, but on her way out, she noticed the door to the attic staircase was ajar, a faint smell musty and sweet wafted. From above, it was the scent of withering paper. The ghost in the garden that evening. Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the Braithwaite estate. The grounds had been silent since Fiona's funeral, with only the gardener, Mr. Temple, and a cleaning girl tending to the household. Sylvia answered the door again. "I don't mean to intrude," Miss Marple said. "I simply wondered if I might have a look at the back garden." "The garden?" "Fiona and I often walked there. It was our ritual of sorts. I find I miss it." Sylvia hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, go on through." The garden had changed little. The sundial was still chipped at the base, and the hedge of clipped laurel still curved in its peculiar heart shape. Miss Marple walked slowly, taking in the scents of rosemary, thyme, and the faint sweetness of damp earth. She paused at the potting. Shed. The door was UNLATCHED. Inside. The air was dense with soil and the ghost of old blossoms. A broken trowel lay on the table, and beside it a worn gardening journal. Miss Marple turned its pages delicately. Most of the entries were Fiona's brief notations of bulbs planted, weeds to be removed. But near the end, one stood out. The 12th of March. "I have made the decision. The clock is my key. They will not expect me to use it this way." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. They, not she. Fiona had feared more than one person. She tucked the journal under her shawl and stepped back into the garden. Suspicion returns when she returned home. She found Inspector Gale waiting at her gate. He removed his hat, ever respectful. "Though visibly weary, we've reviewed Mrs. Shull's statement. It fits, for the most part." "But not entirely," Miss Marple said. "No," Gale admitted. "There's one part that bothers me. The clock, yes, we found it buried. But the mechanism inside had been deliberately tampered with. Not just replaced, altered. Someone wanted it to stop at a very specific time." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "That implies planning," she said. Gale nodded. "It wasn't panic, it was precision." She sighed. "Then Imogen wasn't alone." "No. And we've learned something else. The solicitor's clerk in London says he received a call that week, asking whether Fiona's will could be contested on the grounds of mental instability. The caller gave no name, but we traced the number. It was from a public telephone booth here in the village." Miss Marple was silent. "And now," Gale said quietly, "Jonathan Braithwaite is gone. Packed a bag and left by the midnight train. No note, nothing." Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "I thought you might have an idea where he's gone." "No," she said, her voice soft, "but I know why." The final piece begins to fit. That night, Miss Marple lit a lamp and read Fiona's gardening. Journal again, then returned to her own diary, cross-referencing times, entries, and names. She made no great show of discovery, only a quiet nod to herself. Then she placed 2 envelopes on her writing desk, one addressed to Inspector Gale, and one to Jonathan Braithwaite, care of the boarding house in Bournemouth, where she suspected. He'd fled. The clock on her mantel ticked on. Time, after all, had always been the true witness. Section 13. The bell that never rang the following morning arrived gray and muffled, with a low mist rolling in across the hedgerows and folding itself into every corner of St. Mildred's Mead. It was the kind of weather that seemed to hush the village by force. muting clattering teacups and dulling even the shrillest of gossip. Miss Marple sat quietly at her parlor window, knitting untouched in her lap, as she watched the Vickers bell tower disappear intermittently in the drifting fog. It was a morning for secrets to surface, though gently and on their own accord. She did not have long to wait. At precisely 9:30, there came a knock at her door. She opened it to find young Sylvia Braithwaite, standing pale and trembling, her hat crooked, a letter clutched tightly in one gloved hand. I didn't know who else to go to," Sylvia said in a brittle voice. "Then you've come to exactly the right place," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside. "Come in, dear. You're quite safe here." The letter from Bournemouth Sylvia sat on the edge of the armchair as though expecting to bolt. She placed the letter down upon the tea-table and withdrew her hand as though it had burned her. "It's from Jonathan," she said. "Posted yesterday. He told me to burn it after reading, but I couldn't. I just couldn't." Miss Marple didn't speak. She opened the envelope slowly and drew out the folded sheet of cheap boarding-house paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Jonathan's, hurried, jagged, but still legible. "Sylvia, if you're reading this, then I suppose I've failed to disappear quietly. Perhaps it's just as well. You were never meant for any of this. I never wanted Fiona dead. I swear that. But I did want her silence. And her money. That cursed old clock, she said she'd change her will. Leave everything to some conservation fund. I couldn't allow that. I didn't kill her, not with my own hands. But I knew what Imogen was planning. I let it happen. I watched from the hall that day when she entered the drawing-room. I knew what she'd gone there for, though I told myself IDN single quotes T. after it happened. I took the will, burned it in the old fireplace. You remember the one we never used? I only ask that you forgive me, not for what I've done, but for not being the brother I should have been. J. Miss Marple read it twice before folding it back and setting it down. "And yet," she murmured, "he never called for help. Not even once. Not even after Fiona had fallen." Sylvia stared at her lap. "He was weak. Always had been. Mother said so, and she wasn't wrong." Miss Marple regarded her for a long moment. "Tell me," she said gently, "did Jonathan ever tell you about the clock before?" "That day?" Sylvia looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Only that someone knew Fiona had hidden something in it. Someone who feared what that clock might contain long before Imogen ever did. That's why it was tampered with. That's why it stopped." Sylvia said nothing. "I believe Fiona had told someone about her intention to change the will," Miss Marple continued. "Not Jonathan. Someone else. Someone who might stand to lose even more if Fiona truly cut them off." There was a long silence. Finally, Sylvia's voice came, small and tired. She said she would leave everything to her new trust, that she would expose what we'd been doing. Miss Marple's face remained serene. "And what had you been doing?" "Sylvia?" Sylvia's shoulders slumped. "I used the estate's money. For the home, yes, and for myself. Jonathan didn't know. Fiona found out when she went through the accounts. She was furious, said it was theft, betrayal. So you tried to stop her." Sylvia's face flushed scarlet. "No, I never laid a hand on her. I swear it. But I did ask Imogen to talk to her, to reason with her, maybe frighten her a little. I didn't know she'd lose control." Miss Marple leaned back slightly in her chair. Her voice was calm, not accusing. "And the clock? I found it open one day. The mechanism was strange. I thought if I could make it stop at the right moment, it would confuse things. It was foolish. I thought it might buy time." "Time," Miss Marple echoed. "Always the most valuable currency." Inspector Gale arrives. Miss Marple handed the letter to Inspector Gale later that afternoon, having summoned him with her usual tact and punctuality. He read it silently while standing in her parlor, his brow furrowed deeper with each line. "It's enough to issue a warrant," he said at last, "for both of them." Miss Marple didn't object, but neither did she smile. "Jonathan has fled," she said, "but Sylvia remains. I doubt she'll run. Guilt, you see, has a way of anchoring a person." Gale nodded grimly. "And Imogen? She still believes she was protecting someone. That's what made her vulnerable to manipulation. She was a pawn in Sylvia's larger game, though she never knew it." "And the will?" Miss Marple opened a drawer in her escritoire and retrieved a second envelope. This was tucked inside Fiona's old gardening book. She had a solicitor's copy made. "It seems clever, woman." Gale raised his eyebrows. "And it names the Conservation Fund as sole beneficiary?" "Indeed." Gale exhaled. "So in the end, Fiona won." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Not quite, but justice, I think, has caught up." The wisteria sheds its blooms. That evening the village returned to its quiet self. The mist had lifted, revealing the sharpness of the church spire and the clean outlines of the cottages. The scent of wisteria hung thick in the air, as if the vine itself had been listening all along. Miss Marple took her usual seat on the garden bench, her shawl around her shoulders, a new ball of wool resting at her feet. She cast on the first stitches of a fresh pattern, simple, neat, unshowy. "I always said," she murmured to the wind, "that time would set all things in order." The village clock struck 7 this time. It rang true. Section 14. The timekeeper's truth. The villagers of St. Mildred's Mead were not easily shaken, not permanently, at least. The rhythm of teacups, the murmurs at the post office, and the clink of cutlery at the inn soon returned, though with a hush of reverence whenever Fiona Bletchley's name was spoken. The affair with the stopped clock had rippled across parlors and hedgerows, but the storm had passed on the surface. Only one household had not resumed its routine, the Bletchley residence. The police had formally charged Sylvia Braithwaite with accessory to murder and embezzlement. Imogen Vale, emotionally frail and entangled, but not criminally culpable, had been taken in by distant relatives in Kent. Jonathan Braithwaite remained at large, though his confession ensured his eventual capture would be a matter of procedure rather than detection. But for Miss Marple, the case had not concluded until every piece of the puzzle was placed. And so, when Inspector Gale returned to St. Mary Mead on an unusually crisp morning, he found himself once more sitting across from the quiet force of nature in lace gloves, sipping perfectly brewed Darjeeling in a parlor that had seen more crimes solved than most magistrates' courts. "You were right," he said simply, watching her from over his teacup. "Every detail you pointed to, it all fits." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. "I simply paid attention, Inspector, the way one does when watching one's neighbors or one's geraniums. You notice which way the leaves lean and why. The real sequence of events, it was never really about the clock. Miss Marple began softly, but about what the clock represented: control over time, inheritance, and Fiona's legacy. She poured another measure of tea and continued, without drama. Fiona had made it quite clear she intended to rewrite her will. She told more than one person, including Sylvia. But it wasn't the threat of being cut off that triggered the events. It was Fiona's insistence on righting what she saw as a moral wrong. "You mean Sylvia's embezzlement?" asked Gale. Indeed. Sylvia had quietly siphoned funds from the estate to maintain the household and her personal luxuries. A new set of silver, I believe. Fiona discovered the discrepancies and threatened not only to disinherit her, but to bring in the authorities. It was not an idle threat. But Sylvia didn't kill her? No, Miss Marple said, stirring her tea gently. She's vain, certainly, and prideful, but I do not believe she is violent. However, she is quite skilled in manipulation. She lifted her eyes to meet his. She turned to Imogen, feeding her concern that Fiona would revoke Jonathan's inheritance as well. She framed it as a matter of family loyalty, that Fiona, in her increasing eccentricity, was set to leave everything to a bird sanctuary. Gale leaned back, brow furrowed. And Imogen acted on her own? I believe so. She saw herself as defending Jonathan's future. Her relationship with him, though unofficial, was serious in her mind. Sylvia merely gave her the nudge. Talk to her, she said. Perhaps even frighten her. Miss Marple paused, but Imogen lost control. Perhaps Fiona threatened her in the heat of the moment. Fiona could be rather severe when crossed. Imogen, frightened and impulsive, struck with the nearest object. The clock was already open, its mechanism exposed. The poker was nearby. She killed her in a panic. Yes, and Jonathan witnessed it, but chose not to intervene. He let it happen, then helped to obscure it. Burned the revised will. Tampered with the clock to confuse the timeline. He thought the police would never untangle it. The clocks? Silent testimony. The clock was vital, of course, Miss Marple went on. Not for the time it displayed, but for its peculiar silence. You noticed that straight away, Gale nodded. It stopped precisely at 12:07, but the cause wasn't mechanical failure. It had been halted deliberately. A bent spring, a jammed gear. That suggested interference, not wear and tear. She sipped her tea. More importantly, it told me someone had wanted to create a false timeline, and that someone had a great deal to gain by obscuring when Fiona actually died. Gale sighed. All of them had motive and opportunity. It's almost miraculous that you sorted it out. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Not miraculous, dear. Just patient listening. Sylvia's rehearsed grief, Imogen's inconsistent statements about the drawing room, and Jonathan's very sudden departure. You set a trap, didn't you? Gale asked, admiration in his voice. I invited Sylvia for tea. I spoke quite offhandedly about Fiona's solicitor, how a second might yet surface, and I observed her reaction. Fear, not relief. That told me everything. Restoration and reflection outside. The clock in St. Mildred's bell tower rang 12. Miss Marple looked toward the window and smiled. They've had it repaired, she said. Properly this time. No more frozen hours. Gale rose to leave. You've restored more than time, Miss Marple. She chuckled gently. Oh, I don't know that time was ever truly lost, merely borrowed. As he turned to go, she added, "Do remember, Inspector people rarely kill for things. They kill for emotions, resentment, jealousy, pride, and sometimes a fear of losing control." He nodded, then tipped his hat. "You always make it sound so simple." "Human nature," she replied with a shrug, "is never simple. But it is, at the end of the day, rather predictable." Epilogue. A stitch in time later that afternoon, as the golden light slanted through her parlor window, Miss Marple returned to her embroidery. She had begun a new sampler, wisteria and dandelions twining around the words, "Truth, like time, cannot be stopped." She hummed softly as she worked, the clock ticking steadily beside her. The mystery had ended, but in St. Mary Mead there would always be another whisper beneath the calm, and always Miss Marple ready with her needle, her teacup, and her unerring eye for the truth.